I found out that my sister took all our father's money and left him to beg on the streets. So we gave her the award she never expected. I hadn't seen my dad in 3 years because my sister Ruby told me he'd moved to Florida with his new girlfriend. She said he was living his best life, too busy with beach days and golf to call his other daughter. He literally told me he needs space from his old life, Ruby would say whenever I asked for his number. He'll reach out when he's ready. Don't be clingy. Ruby had always been Dad's favorite. When Mom died, he leaned on her completely. She handled the estate, the finances, and the funeral arrangements. I was too young to help much, and Ruby said she didn't mind taking care of everything. That's what older sisters do, she'd say. I'll make sure Dad's okay. After everything was settled, Ruby said Dad wanted to downsize and simplify. She helped him sell the house, his car, most of his belongings. He doesn't need all that stuff anymore. He wants to travel and be free. The house sale should have given him plenty to live on, but Ruby said he'd invested it all in some retirement community in Florida that didn't allow visitors for the first 5 years. It's like a spiritual retreat for seniors, she explained. Very exclusive. I believed her because why would she lie? She'd send me occasional updates about Dad being happy and healthy, photos that were always blurry or taken from behind. He's gotten really private in his old age, she'd explain. Doesn't like cameras anymore. Ruby, meanwhile, was thriving. She'd bought a huge house, drove a luxury car, and wore designer everything. She said her consulting business had taken off, but she was vague about what exactly she consulted on. Then one day, I was downtown for a work meeting when I saw a homeless man sitting against a building. Something about his posture seemed familiar. I walked closer, and my heart stopped. It was Dad. He was thin, dirty, holding a cardboard sign that said, "Anything helps." I ran over, and he looked up at me with hollow eyes. It took him a moment to recognize me. "Sweetie, is that really you?" He started crying. I asked him what happened, why he was here, and where Florida and the retirement community were. He looked confused. "Florida? I've never been to Florida. I've been here since Ruby put me in that care facility 2 years ago." The story came out in pieces. Ruby had convinced him to sign a power of attorney when Mom died, saying it would make handling the estate easier. Then she'd sold everything he owned and put him in the cheapest care facility she could find. When his money ran out after 6 months, the facility kicked him out. He'd been on the streets for over a year. Ruby said she'd handle everything. She said the house sale would cover my care forever, he said. But they told me there was no more money. Ruby stopped answering when they called her. I took Dad to my apartment immediately, fed him, got him cleaned up, gave him a bed. Then I started digging into what Ruby had done. The house had sold for $800,000. Dad's retirement accounts had been worth another $400,000. His car, belongings, Mom's jewelry, and everything together were close to $2 million. Ruby had taken it all. The care facility she'd put him in costs $500 a month. She'd paid for exactly 6 months, $3,000 out of $2 million, then left him to die on the streets. I called Ruby, pretending nothing was wrong. Said I was planning a surprise trip to Florida to see Dad and needed the retirement community's address. She panicked. "Oh, he actually just moved to Europe." "Yeah, he's backpacking through Europe. Very hard to reach." I told her that it was amazing and I'd love to see pictures from his trip. She said he'd lost his phone. I said we should video call him. She said the time zones made it impossible. I said I was worried and wanted proof he was okay. She hung up on me. The next day was Ruby's big moment. She was receiving a Woman of the Year award from the city's business council. Hundreds of people would be there. Local news was covering it. She'd been bragging about it for months. She was supposed to give a speech about building success from nothing. Dad and I showed up right as Ruby took the stage. She was midway through talking about how she'd sacrificed everything to build her empire when she saw us. Her face went white. She stumbled over her words, tried to continue but couldn't focus. "The hardest part of success is doing it alone," she was saying. "Having no support system, no family help, just your own determination." That's when Dad stood up. His voice cut through the fancy ballroom like a knife through butter. Dad stood up in the clean button-down shirt and khakis I'd bought him at Target the day before, his hands shaking slightly but his voice steady and clear. He looked at Ruby on that stage with her designer dress and perfect hair and said loud enough for everyone to hear that she'd stolen everything from him and left him to sleep in doorways for over a year. The room went completely silent except for the sound of Ruby's microphone feedback. I watched her face change from white to bright red as 300 people in evening gowns and suits turned to stare at her. She opened her mouth but nothing came out. A woman at the table next to us gasped and whispered something to her husband. 2 security guards in dark suits started walking toward Dad from different sides of the room. They moved quickly at first, but then slowed down when they got closer, and saw he was just an old man standing calmly with tears running down his face. He wasn't yelling or making threats or moving toward the stage. He just stood there looking at Ruby with the saddest expression I'd ever seen. Ruby tried to keep going with her speech about building success from nothing, but her voice cracked. The microphone cut off with a loud screech that made everyone wince. The business council president rushed onto the stage from the side, a short man in a tuxedo who looked totally confused about what was happening. He tried to take Ruby's arm, but she jerked away from him. Ruby turned and practically ran toward a side exit near the stage. Her high heels clicked fast on the floor and she nearly tripped on the bottom step. A woman with a camera and a press badge hanging around her neck blocked the door. I recognized her from the local news station that had been covering the awards ceremony. The reporter held up her camera and started asking Ruby questions, but I couldn't hear what she was saying over all the noise in the room. Ruby shoved past her without saying a word and disappeared through the door. I helped Dad sit back down in his chair because he was shaking really bad now. His hands were ice cold when I touched them, and he couldn't stop trembling. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I could see how much standing up and speaking had taken out of him. The ceremony completely fell apart around us. People pulled out their phones and started taking pictures and videos. Everyone was whispering and pointing at Dad, and then at the empty stage where Ruby had been. Some people got up and left. Others crowded closer to get a better look at us. I heard someone say Ruby's name and then the word fraud. Aurora appeared out of nowhere and grabbed my arm. She'd been sitting 3 tables away and pushed through the crowd to reach us. She helped me get Dad to his feet, and we started moving toward the exit. My legs felt like jelly, but I kept walking. A security guard tried to stop us, but Aurora told him we were leaving voluntarily, and he stepped aside. We made it to the parking lot before anyone could follow us, or before security decided to kick Dad out for disrupting the event. Back at my apartment that night, Dad sat on my couch and started crying. Not quiet tears, but big sobbing sounds that made his whole body shake. He kept saying he was sorry over and over. Sorry for ruining everything. Sorry for destroying my relationship with Ruby. Sorry for making a scene at such an important event. I sat next to him and put my arms around his thin shoulders. I told him Ruby ruined everything herself the moment she stole his money and left him on the streets to die. I said she deserved what happened and more. He cried harder and said Ruby was still my sister and now I'd never get her back. I didn't tell him I didn't want her back. I just held him until he fell asleep, sitting up with his head on my shoulder. My phone started going crazy the next morning before I even got out of bed. Text messages and missed calls from relatives I hadn't talked to in years. Aunt Linda, who I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral. Cousin Mike, who moved to Texas 5 years ago. Uncle Robert, who Dad used to play golf with. They all wanted to know what happened at the ceremony. Someone had posted a video online and it was spreading fast. I watched it on my phone with the sound turned down so I wouldn't wake Dad. You could see him standing up and hear his voice saying Ruby stole from him. You could see Ruby's face going red and the security guards approaching. The video had over 50,000 views already. The comments were full of people calling Ruby terrible names and others saying Dad must be crazy. Then I saw Ruby had posted her own statement on social media. She claimed Dad was mentally ill and I was taking advantage of him for attention. She said he'd been unstable since Mom died, and she'd been trying to help him for years. Several relatives had already commented supporting her version. Dad's coughing woke me up around noon. He'd been coughing on and off since I found him, but now it sounded really bad. Deep rattling sounds that came from his chest. I made him get dressed and drove him to a walk-in clinic near my apartment. The waiting room was packed, but we only waited an hour. A young doctor with glasses examined Dad and listened to his lungs with a stethoscope. She asked how long he'd been coughing and where he'd been living. When I told her he'd been homeless for over a year, she nodded like that explained everything. She said he had a respiratory infection and was badly malnourished. She wrote prescriptions for antibiotics and cough medicine and vitamins. The pharmacy bill came to almost $200, even with my insurance covering him as a dependent. I put it on my credit card and tried not to think about my bank account. My phone rang while we were driving home from the pharmacy. Ruby's name flashed on the screen and my stomach dropped. I almost didn't answer, but Dad was sitting right there watching me. I put it on speaker. Ruby started screaming before I could even say hello. She said I'd destroyed her reputation and humiliated her in front of everyone who mattered in this city. She said I'd ruined her career and her life over misunderstandings about Dad's care. Her voice was so loud and high it hurt my ears. I waited until she stopped to breathe and then I said $2 million. Just those 3 words. $2 million. Ruby went silent for a second and then the line went dead. When I tried to call back, it went straight to voicemail. She'd blocked my number. Aurora came over that evening with takeout food and her laptop. She said we needed to find Dad a lawyer because this was way bigger than either of us knew how to handle. We sat at my kitchen table eating Chinese food and searching for elder abuse attorneys. Most of them had fancy websites and expensive-looking offices. Their consultation fees started at $500. Aurora kept searching and found a woman named Diane Hodges, who specialized in financial exploitation cases. Her website said she offered free initial consultations for elderly victims. I called and left a message explaining our situation. Diane's assistant called back the next morning and scheduled us for an appointment 2 days later. I spent those 2 days gathering every document I could find. I printed out the house sale records from the county website. I found Mom's will in a box of papers Dad had kept in a storage unit before Ruby sold everything. The will left everything equally to Dad, with Ruby and me as secondary beneficiaries after he died. I found the power of attorney paperwork Ruby had Dad sign with a date 3 days after Mom's funeral. I made copies of everything and put it all in a folder. Dad and I drove to Diane's office in a professional building downtown. Her waiting room had comfortable chairs and magazines. Diane came out to meet us herself. She was maybe 50 with gray hair and a kind face. She brought us into her office and listened to Dad tell his story for almost an hour. She took notes and asked questions about dates and amounts. When Dad finished, Diane sat back in her chair and said this was one of the worst cases of family theft she'd ever seen. Then she said recovery would be extremely difficult, and we needed to understand that going in. Diane leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen against the folder of documents I'd brought. She said Ruby had legal authority through the power of attorney Dad signed, which made everything more complicated than just theft. Criminal charges were possible, but we'd need to prove Ruby intended to steal from Dad instead of just managing his money badly. Court saw those as different things, and proving intent was hard. She said the power of attorney gave Ruby the right to make financial decisions for Dad, and she could argue she was trying to help him by putting him in a care facility. The fact that she abandoned him when the money ran out looked bad, but wasn't automatically criminal. We'd need to show she planned to take the money from the beginning and never intended to use it for Dad's care. Diane asked if we had any evidence of Ruby talking about taking Dad's money or hiding what she was doing. I shook my head because Ruby had been careful to sound concerned about Dad whenever she talked to me. She'd created a whole story about Florida and retirement communities and made it sound like she was helping him live his dream. Diane said that made criminal prosecution harder because Ruby could claim she genuinely thought she was helping Dad and just made poor decisions with his money. She could say the care facility was more expensive than expected, or that Dad's needs changed, or any number of excuses that would make it look like mistakes instead of theft. The consultation ended and Diane handed me an invoice for $300. I stared at the number and felt my stomach drop because I didn't have $300 to spare after covering Dad's prescriptions and food and everything else. Diane must have seen something in my face because she asked about my financial situation. I told her I made decent money at my job, but I was already stretched thin supporting Dad and myself in a one-bedroom apartment. She looked at the invoice and then crossed out the amount and wrote $150 instead. She said she'd reduce her fee this time, but I needed to understand that a full legal battle would cost tens of thousands in attorney fees. She'd seen cases like this drag on for years with depositions and expert witnesses and court filings that added up fast. Even if we won completely and got a judgment saying Ruby had to pay back everything she stole, there was no guarantee we'd actually recover the money. Ruby could hide assets or claim she'd already spent everything or declare bankruptcy. Diane had clients who won their cases and never saw a dollar because the person who stole from them had made the money disappear. I paid the reduced fee with my credit card and tried not to think about my growing balance. Dad was quiet on the drive home, and I could tell something was wrong by how he kept wringing his hands. Back at my apartment, he sat on the couch and started breathing fast with his chest heaving. No, he said we should drop everything and forget about Ruby, because going after her would cost me everything I had. His voice got higher and faster as he talked about how I'd end up in debt trying to get his money back, and then we'd both be broke and homeless. I sat next to him and took his hands to stop them from shaking. I told him Ruby already took everything from him and left him to die on the streets, and I wouldn't let her get away with that. I said I'd go into debt if I had to, because some things mattered more than money. He started crying and saying he wasn't worth ruining my life over, but I held him until he calmed down. The next morning, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as Detective Jeremy Koch from the Financial Crimes Unit. He said he'd seen news coverage of the ceremony disruption and wanted to know more about what happened with Dad. Jeremy asked if I could come to the police station to talk about whether Ruby's actions might be criminal elder abuse under state law. I scheduled a meeting for the next day and felt hope for the first time since Diane's warnings about how hard this would be. Jeremy's office was small with filing cabinets and a desk covered in folders. He shook Dad's hand gently and offered him coffee before sitting down with a notepad. The interview lasted 3 hours with Jeremy asking detailed questions about when Ruby got the power of attorney and what she told Dad about where his money was going. Dad struggled to remember exact dates after everything he'd been through on the streets. Jeremy stayed patient and helped Dad work through the timeline by asking about seasons and holidays and other events that might jog his memory. He wrote down how Ruby isolated Dad from me by lying about Florida and how she'd stopped answering calls from the care facility when they said Dad's money had run out. Jeremy asked if Ruby ever visited Dad at the care facility, and Dad said she came once in the first month and never again. A week after the ceremony, a thick envelope arrived in my mail with a law firm's return address. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Ruby's lawyer demanding we stop slandering her publicly. The letter said we were making false accusations that damaged Ruby's reputation and business, and we needed to stop immediately or face a defamation lawsuit. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Diane, who called me back within an hour. She said truth was an absolute defense to defamation, and we had extensive documentation of Ruby's theft and abandonment. She'd draft a response explaining that we had bank records and witness statements and care facility documents proving everything we'd said about Ruby was true. I spent that evening setting up a fundraising page to cover Dad's medical expenses and legal fees. I wrote carefully about finding an elderly family member on the streets and the costs of getting them healthy and housed again without naming Ruby directly. I included photos of receipts from the pharmacy and doctor visits and explained we were pursuing legal action to recover stolen funds. Within 2 days, we raised $4,000 from complete strangers who'd heard about the ceremony incident and wanted to help. People left comments saying they'd dealt with similar family theft or had elderly parents they worried about. Then Ruby posted on social media claiming Dad had abandoned the family years ago, and she'd been searching for him the whole time. She posted what looked like old missing person flyers with Dad's photo saying she'd distributed them around the city trying to find him. Several relatives I barely knew started commenting on her post calling me terrible for elder abuse and saying I was clearly manipulating Dad for money. My aunt sent me a long message about how disappointed she was that I'd turn on family and how Ruby had always been nothing but generous. Dad's tooth started hurting badly 2 weeks after we saw Diane. His whole jaw swelled up and he couldn't eat anything without crying from pain. I took him to an emergency dentist who said he had a severe infection from years without dental care. The tooth needed to come out immediately before the infection spread to his bloodstream. The extraction cost $800 even with my insurance, and I put it on my credit card while trying not to look at my balance. The dentist said Dad needed thousands more in dental work for other damaged teeth, but we couldn't afford it right now. Diane called to say she was filing a civil lawsuit against Ruby for breach of fiduciary duty and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and conversion of assets. The filing would become public record, which meant reporters could access it and write about the case. She warned me this would make everything more public and Ruby would probably fight back hard. 2 days later, a local newspaper ran a detailed story about the case with quotes from people who'd been at the ceremony. The article included the amounts Ruby had stolen and how little she'd spent on Dad's care and how long he'd been homeless. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, all asking if the story was true. Ruby called relatives and old family friends claiming I was holding Dad hostage and making up stories about her. My phone kept buzzing with angry messages from people I barely knew telling me I should be ashamed. One cousin I hadn't spoken to in 5 years left a voicemail saying I was destroying the family and breaking Dad's heart by turning him against Ruby. I blocked most of them after the 10th message accusing me of being jealous of Ruby's success. Jeremy called 3 days after the newspaper story ran and asked me to come to the police station with Dad. He sat us down in a small interview room and explained that building a criminal case would take months because he needed extensive documentation. Bank records had to be subpoenaed from multiple institutions where Ruby held accounts. The care facility needed to provide detailed payment records and communication logs showing when Ruby stopped responding. He needed statements from anyone who witnessed Ruby's control over Dad's finances or her lies about his whereabouts. The forensic accounting alone would take weeks to trace how Ruby moved the money and what she spent it on. Jeremy said proving Ruby intended to defraud Dad rather than just mismanaging his money poorly was the hardest part. Defense lawyers could argue she made bad financial decisions, but didn't mean to steal from him. He needed to show a pattern of deliberate deception, intentional isolation, and calculated abandonment. Every piece of evidence had to be documented and verified before the district attorney would even consider filing charges. Dad looked exhausted hearing how long this would take and asked if we really had to go through all this. Jeremy told him the criminal case was separate from the civil lawsuit Diane was handling, and both were necessary to get any kind of justice. I took Dad home and tried to focus on keeping him healthy while Jeremy built his case. 3 weeks after I found him on that street corner, Dad collapsed in my apartment while getting up to use the bathroom. I heard the thud from my bedroom and ran out to find him unconscious on the floor. I called 911 and rode in the ambulance while paramedics checked his vital signs and asked questions I couldn't answer about his medical history. The emergency room doctor said Dad was severely dehydrated despite drinking water regularly, and the malnutrition from months on the streets had damaged his kidneys and liver. They admitted him overnight for IV fluids and monitoring. The hospital bill came to $2,000 in copays even with my insurance covering most of it. I maxed out my credit card paying the ambulance fee and emergency room charges my insurance refused to cover. The financial counselor at the hospital suggested payment plans, but I knew I couldn't afford monthly installments on top of everything else. I sat in the hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. doing math on my phone and realizing I was going broke trying to fix what Ruby destroyed. A social worker named Aria visited Dad's hospital room the next morning while he was getting IV fluids. She was young and kind and asked detailed questions about his living situation and how he ended up homeless. Dad told her the whole story about Ruby and the stolen money and being kicked out of the care facility. Arya listened carefully and took notes, then explained that Dad didn't qualify for most government assistance programs because he technically had assets. The fact that Ruby stole the money and we couldn't access it didn't matter to the eligibility systems. He owned nothing but wasn't considered destitute enough for emergency housing or food assistance because somewhere in bank accounts he couldn't touch. $2 million existed with his name attached to the original source. I wanted to scream at how broken the system was, but Arya seemed genuinely upset too. She said she saw this constantly with financial abuse victims who fell through every safety net because bureaucracy couldn't keep up with how family members stole from vulnerable people. Before she left, Arya wrote down information for a nonprofit that specifically helped homeless elderly people transition back to stable housing. She said they might be able to provide temporary assistance with food and basic needs while we fought through the legal process to recover Dad's money. It was the first real help anyone from any official system had offered us. I called the nonprofit that afternoon and spoke to a case manager who scheduled an intake appointment for the following week. They provided grocery vouchers and connected Dad with a volunteer doctor who would see him for free to manage his ongoing health issues. The case manager explained their services were limited and temporary, but they understood how long legal processes took. For the first time since finding Dad, I felt like someone actually understood what we were dealing with instead of just telling us what forms to fill out. 2 days after Dad got released from the hospital, Diane called to say Ruby's lawyer had sent a settlement offer. Ruby would pay Dad $50,000 if he dropped all legal claims and signed a non-disclosure agreement promising never to speak publicly about what happened. Diane calculated this was less than 3% of what Ruby actually stole and told me in very clear terms that accepting would be stupid. The offer was designed to make the problem go away cheaply, while Ruby kept the rest of the money and avoided any real consequences. Diane said we should reject it immediately and prepare for Ruby to fight much harder as the case progressed. I was working full-time at my regular job while caring for Dad and managing meetings with lawyers and police and social workers. Aurora started showing up at my apartment almost every evening with groceries or prepared meals because she could see I was falling apart. She did laundry and cleaned my kitchen and sat with Dad when I had to work late so he wouldn't be alone. I told her she didn't have to do all this, but she said watching me try to handle everything solo was making her crazy. I didn't know how I would survive without her help, and told her that at least twice a week while crying from exhaustion. Diane called again a week later to say she was hiring a forensic accountant named Dominic to trace where Ruby's money actually came from. His fees were expensive at $200 per hour, but Diane said we needed proof that Ruby's supposedly successful consulting business was funded entirely by Dad's stolen inheritance. Without that documentation, Ruby could claim she earned her wealth legitimately and just happened to mismanage Dad's money separately. Dominic would examine Ruby's business accounts, tax returns, and spending patterns to show the timeline of when her wealth appeared and how it matched exactly with when she liquidated Dad's assets. I agreed to the forensic accounting even though I had no idea how I'd pay for it. Diane said Dominic estimated needing 20 to 30 hours to complete his analysis, which meant $4,000 to $6,000 in fees. She offered to bill me in installments after we recovered funds from Ruby, essentially gambling that we'd win enough to cover her costs. I appreciated her confidence but felt sick thinking about going deeper into debt on the possibility of maybe getting some money back eventually. A woman named Pamela contacted Diane after seeing the news coverage about Ruby's lawsuit. Pamela had worked with Ruby at their previous company 3 years ago and wanted to provide testimony about Ruby's suspicious wealth. She told Diane that Ruby's consulting business barely had any actual clients back then, and everyone at the office wondered how Ruby suddenly afforded a luxury car and designer clothes. Pamela remembered Ruby bragging about a big inheritance but being vague about where it came from. She said multiple colleagues had discussed how Ruby's lifestyle didn't match her reported income and suspected something shady was happening. Diane was thrilled to have a witness who could testify about Ruby's lies regarding her business success. Ruby's lawyer filed a countersuit 2 weeks after we rejected the settlement offer. The filing claimed I had kidnapped Dad from a care facility where he was receiving treatment and was now forcing him to make false accusations while financially exploiting him. Ruby's lawyer demanded Dad undergo a psychological evaluation to prove he was mentally competent to make his own decisions and wasn't being manipulated. The countersuit painted me as an opportunistic younger sister who swooped in to steal Dad away from Ruby's care and was now trying to steal Ruby's legitimately earned money. Diane said the countersuit was a standard intimidation tactic meant to make us back down, but Dad was devastated reading the accusations. He kept saying he didn't want me to suffer because of him, and maybe we should just drop everything. I told him we were doing the evaluation to prove he was fine, and then we were continuing the case because Ruby didn't get to steal everything, and then play victim. Dad agreed to the psychological evaluation, even though the idea of proving his mental competence felt degrading after everything he'd survived. The evaluation took 3 hours in a psychologist's office where Dad answered questions about his memory, decision-making ability, and understanding of his financial situation. The psychologist was professional, but some of the questions felt designed to make Dad look confused or incompetent. She asked him to recall specific dates from years ago and solve math problems and explain complex legal concepts. Dad struggled with some answers because trauma and malnutrition had affected his cognitive function, but he clearly understood what Ruby had done and why he wanted his money back. The psychologist's report confirmed Dad had mild cognitive impairment from his ordeal, but was fully capable of understanding his situation and making informed decisions about his own life and finances. Eddie Morrow arrived at Diane's office 3 days after the evaluation report came back. He walked in carrying a thick manila folder and introduced himself as the manager from Sunnybrook Care Facility, where Ruby had placed Dad 2 years earlier. Eddie looked tired and guilty as he sat down across from us in the conference room. He opened the folder and spread out payment records, call logs, and handwritten notes across the table. The documents showed Ruby paid exactly $3,000 upfront for 6 months of basic care, then stopped responding to phone calls when the facility tried to reach her about renewal. Eddie had made 17 documented attempts to contact Ruby over a 3-week period before they had no choice but to discharge Dad for non-payment. He kept detailed notes because something felt wrong about the whole situation. Ruby had visited Dad exactly twice during those 6 months, both times staying less than 10 minutes and refusing to discuss his care plan or future arrangements. Eddie suspected financial abuse but didn't know how to report it without proof, and Dad seemed confused about his financial situation. The notes showed Dad repeatedly asking Eddie when Ruby would bring more money for his care, because she'd promised the house sale would cover everything. Eddie had tried explaining to Dad that there was no money in his account, but Dad insisted Ruby was handling it and would fix the problem soon. Dominic called Diane the following week with his preliminary analysis results. He'd traced every deposit into Ruby's personal accounts for the past 3 years and found large sums that matched perfectly with the timing of the house sale and Dad's retirement account liquidations. Ruby deposited $800,000 from the house sale directly into her checking account, then moved most of it to investments within days. The retirement accounts got cashed out and deposited in smaller chunks over several months, probably to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts at the bank. She made minimal effort to hide the transfers or create false documentation. Dominic said Ruby apparently felt confident Dad would never be in a position to challenge her or even know what she'd done. The timeline showed Ruby buying her luxury car 2 weeks after the house sale deposit cleared. Her mortgage down payment on the big house came 1 month later. Designer purchases and expensive trips lined up perfectly with each new deposit of Dad's money into her accounts. 2 months after the ceremony, Ruby's reputation in the business community was completely destroyed. Aurora showed me social media posts from the business council quietly removing Ruby from their featured members page. 3 different professional organizations dropped her from their boards without public announcements. Her consulting contracts dried up as clients distanced themselves from the scandal. One former client posted a vague statement about ending their business relationship due to personal matters, and several others just stopped listing her as their consultant on their websites. Ruby's LinkedIn profile went from constantly updated with new achievements to completely silent. Her last post was from the day before the ceremony, bragging about the upcoming Woman of the Year award. People who used to comment on all her posts with congratulations and praise now left her updates completely ignored. A local business magazine that had planned a feature article about her success story pulled the piece entirely. The editor sent a brief email to Diane saying they couldn't move forward with coverage given the ongoing legal situation. Jeremy stopped by my apartment one evening with news about the criminal case. He sat at my kitchen table looking frustrated while Dad made tea in the background. The district attorney was reviewing everything Jeremy had gathered but seemed hesitant about filing charges. Jeremy explained that family financial cases are extremely difficult to prosecute because juries often see them as private family matters rather than real crimes. Even with clear evidence of theft, prosecutors worry about the he said, she said problem where Ruby could claim Dad gave her permission or was confused about their arrangements. The power of attorney Ruby had made everything legally murky because she did have authorization to manage Dad's finances. Proving she intended to defraud him rather than just managing his money poorly required showing a clear pattern of deception and personal benefit. Jeremy said the DA wanted more evidence of intent before committing to criminal charges, and they were particularly interested in whether Ruby had done this to anyone else, which would establish a pattern of exploitation rather than a one-time family dispute. That question got answered 2 weeks later when Diane received a call from an attorney named Patty Cobb. Patty represented the family of an 82-year-old woman named Margaret Simmons, who'd had Ruby as her financial consultant 3 years ago. Margaret's daughter had seen the news coverage about our case and recognized Ruby's name immediately. Patty explained that Ruby had convinced Margaret to sign a power of attorney for help managing investments, then systematically drained $200,000 from Margaret's accounts over 8 months. The family discovered the theft when Margaret had a stroke and they took over her finances. They'd settled with Ruby privately for $75,000 and signed a non-disclosure agreement because they wanted to avoid the stress of a trial while Margaret recovered. Patty said she'd advised against the NDA at the time, but the family was desperate to resolve things quickly. She'd kept detailed records of everything and was willing to provide them to help our case. Diane immediately contacted Jeremy with this information. Within days, he found another similar case involving a retired teacher named Frank Harry who'd lost $150,000 to Ruby's consulting services. Frank's son had also settled quietly with Ruby and signed an NDA after Ruby threatened a lengthy legal battle they couldn't afford. Both families were now willing to break their NDAs and testify about Ruby's pattern of exploiting elderly clients. Diane filed an emergency motion to freeze Ruby's assets before she could hide or spend what remained of the stolen money. The motion laid out the evidence of Ruby's theft and her pattern of exploitation with other elderly victims. Ruby's lawyer filed an aggressive response claiming the freeze would cause Ruby severe financial hardship. They argued Ruby needed access to her funds for basic living expenses and to maintain her business operations. Ruby's response painted her as a struggling single woman being persecuted by family members who wanted her money. She claimed the funds in her accounts were legitimately earned through years of hard work building her consulting business. The legal arguments went back and forth for 3 weeks while the judge reviewed bank records and financial documentation. The judge granted a partial asset freeze at a hearing I attended with Dad and Diane. Ruby sat across the courtroom with her lawyer, refusing to make eye contact with us. The judge reviewed the evidence and said there was sufficient cause for concern about Ruby hiding assets before the case resolved. He limited Ruby to $5,000 per month in spending, while preserving the bulk of her accounts and preventing her from selling her house or major assets. Ruby's lawyer immediately objected, arguing that $5,000 monthly was poverty level and would prevent Ruby from maintaining her business and lifestyle. The judge looked directly at Ruby and noted that $5,000 per month was significantly more than Ruby had given Dad to survive on. He said Ruby could file detailed expense reports if she needed additional funds for legitimate costs, but the court wasn't going to allow unrestricted access while serious theft allegations were pending. Ruby's face flushed red as the judge spoke. She whispered urgently to her lawyer, but he shook his head, apparently telling her there was nothing more he could do at this hearing. Dad started having nightmares about 3 weeks after we filed the lawsuit. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning to hear him crying out in his sleep from the living room where he slept on my couch. The first few times I rushed out to check on him, he was disoriented and didn't recognize where he was. He'd be looking around my apartment in panic, asking where his spot under the bridge was and whether someone had stolen his blanket. It took several minutes each time to orient him back to reality and convince him he was safe in my home. The nightmares happened several times a week and left Dad exhausted and anxious during the day. Aria came by after I called her about the situation. She gave me information for a therapist named Mark Sullivan who specialized in trauma from homelessness. Mark had openings and agreed to see Dad twice a week on a sliding scale fee we could barely afford. The therapy sessions slowly started helping Dad process what had happened to him. Mark taught him grounding techniques for when he woke up disoriented. Dad began keeping a journal about his experiences on the streets, which Mark said would help him work through the trauma instead of having it ambush him in nightmares. Ruby's former friends started reaching out to me privately as news of the case spread through their social circles. A woman named Jennifer texted me through Facebook after finding my profile. She said she'd been in Ruby's book club for 2 years and always wondered how Ruby afforded her lifestyle. Ruby would complain constantly about having no family support and building everything herself, but she'd show up wearing $1,000 shoes and carrying designer bags. Jennifer remembered Ruby bragging about being completely self-made while displaying wealth that didn't match someone running a struggling consulting startup. Another former friend named Melissa called Diane directly and offered to testify. She said Ruby once drunkenly admitted at a party that family money had given her a head start, but then got angry and defensive when people asked follow-up questions. Ruby had dropped several friends over the years who questioned her too much about her finances or business success. Multiple people contacted us with similar stories about Ruby's deceptive behavior patterns and suspicious wealth. Several offered to testify about specific conversations where Ruby's stories about her income and business success didn't add up. 3 months into the legal battle, I was $20,000 in debt and falling further behind every week. The fundraiser had brought in $4,000 initially, but donations had slowed to almost nothing. Diane's fees were accumulating faster than I could pay them despite her reduced rates and payment plans. Dad's medical bills kept coming even with insurance because he needed so much care after years of neglect. I picked up every overtime shift my job offered and stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. My credit cards were maxed out and I'd borrowed money from Aurora that I had no idea how to repay. I was 2 months behind on rent, and my landlord had started sending warning notices about eviction. The stress of working overtime while managing Dad's care and the lawsuit left me exhausted and barely functioning. I'd lie awake at night doing math in my head, trying to figure out how to pay for everything we needed. Dad noticed my stress and kept apologizing for being a burden. He'd suggest dropping the lawsuit so I could get back to my normal life. I'd tell him we were seeing this through no matter what it cost because Ruby didn't get to destroy both our lives and walk away. Diane called me in for a meeting 2 weeks after we filed the lawsuit, and I could tell from her voice on the phone that something was wrong. I sat across from her desk while she pulled up spreadsheets on her computer and started explaining what the forensic accountant had found. Ruby had burned through most of the money already on her house, cars, designer clothes, expensive vacations, and luxury items that depreciated the moment she bought them. The house had a massive mortgage, and Ruby had taken out loans against it. Her cars were leased, not owned. Most of the jewelry and designer bags could be sold, but wouldn't bring in nearly what Ruby paid for them. Diane estimated that even if we won completely and got a judgment for the full $2 million plus interest, Ruby probably had less than $600,000 in actual recoverable assets. The rest was gone, spent on a lifestyle Ruby couldn't maintain without stealing more money. I felt sick listening to Diane explain how Ruby had essentially gambled away Dad's entire inheritance on appearing successful. We might spend years fighting in court and tens of thousands more in legal fees just to recover a fraction of what Ruby stole. Diane said we could still pursue the case and maybe Ruby would be forced to pay over time through wage garnishment, but that could take decades and there was no guarantee Ruby would ever earn enough to repay what she took. I left Diane's office feeling crushed and drove home in a fog. Dad was waiting for me in the apartment and could tell immediately that something was wrong. I explained what Diane had told me and watched his face fall as he realized that even if we won, we might never get his money back. 3 days later, Jeremy called with news that felt like the first real break we'd had. His investigation into Ruby's finances had uncovered something the forensic accountant missed because it involved her tax returns rather than bank records. Ruby had filed fraudulent tax returns for the past 3 years, claiming massive business expenses that were actually personal purchases. She'd written off the luxury car as a business vehicle, claimed her designer wardrobe was necessary for client meetings, and deducted her expensive vacations as business travel. The IRS would definitely be interested in tax fraud involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in false deductions. Jeremy said this could add federal charges to Ruby's legal troubles, and might actually help our case because the IRS had more power to seize assets than we did in civil court. If Ruby got charged with tax fraud, the federal government would go after her hard, and might recover money that could eventually come back to Dad through restitution. I felt a tiny spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Jeremy warned me that federal cases moved slowly, and could take years to resolve, but at least Ruby would face serious consequences beyond just our civil lawsuit. I thanked him and hung up, then immediately called Diane to tell her what Jeremy had found. She sounded excited and said the tax fraud evidence strengthened our civil case because it proved Ruby's intent to deceive, rather than just poor money management. The following week, Ruby's lawyer contacted Diane with a new settlement offer. Ruby would pay $200,000 to make everything go away, drop all countersuits, and sign a non-disclosure agreement so we couldn't talk publicly about what she'd done. Diane called me to discuss the offer, and I could hear the skepticism in her voice. She said $200,000 was closer to reasonable than Ruby's first insulting offer of $50,000, but it was still only 10% of what Ruby had actually stolen from Dad. Diane recommended we reject the offer and continue fighting because Ruby was clearly getting desperate as more evidence piled up against her. The tax fraud discovery had probably scared Ruby into trying to settle before federal charges got filed. I told Diane I needed to talk to Dad before making any decisions about settlement. That night, I explained Ruby's offer to Dad while we ate dinner in my tiny kitchen. I expected him to be angry that Ruby thought she could buy her way out of this for 10% of what she stole. Instead, Dad put down his fork and said something that surprised me completely. He said he'd consider settling if it meant ending this nightmare and getting enough money to live on his own again. He was exhausted by the legal process, exhausted by living in my apartment, exhausted by fighting with Ruby through lawyers. He just wanted peace and enough money to rent a small place and live independently. Perfect justice wasn't worth years more of legal battles that were destroying both our lives. I spent the next 2 days struggling with what Dad had said. Part of me wanted to fight Ruby to the bitter end and force her to pay back every penny she stole, even if it took decades. But another part of me understood Dad's position because I was exhausted too. The legal battle had consumed my entire life for months. I was drowning in debt, working overtime constantly, stressed beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Maybe $200,000 wasn't enough, but it would get Dad into decent housing with money left over for medical care and basic needs. I called Aurora and asked her to come over because I needed someone to talk sense into me. She listened to me go back and forth about settlement versus continuing the fight, then said something that cut through all my confusion. This was ultimately Dad's decision about his own money and his own life. My role was to support him regardless of what he chose, not to push him toward the outcome I wanted. If Dad needed peace more than perfect justice, that was his choice to make. I realized she was right and called Diane the next morning. I told her to negotiate hard on the settlement, but that we were open to resolving this if Ruby came up significantly on the money. Diane said she'd push Ruby's lawyer for at least $400,000 plus, covering all our legal fees and Dad's medical expenses. 4 months after the ceremony disruption, the preliminary hearing for potential criminal charges finally happened. Dad and I sat in the courtroom with Jeremy while we waited for Ruby to arrive with her lawyer. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Ruby had lost weight and looked stressed in a way I'd never seen before. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a plain dark suit that looked like something from a regular department store. Her hair wasn't professionally styled and she had dark circles under her eyes. This wasn't the confident woman who'd stood on stage accepting awards and bragging about her success. And this was someone who'd been backed into a corner and knew her lies were finally catching up with her. Ruby sat at the defense table without looking at us once. Her lawyer did most of the talking while the prosecutor presented evidence of financial exploitation and theft by deception. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed the documentation, and asked Ruby's lawyer several pointed questions about the power of attorney abuse and Dad's abandonment. Ruby's lawyer tried to argue that Ruby had made poor financial decisions but hadn't committed crimes, but the judge didn't seem convinced. After 2 hours of testimony and arguments, the judge found probable cause for criminal charges of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and theft by deception. Ruby was formally charged and the judge set bail at $50,000. Ruby's lawyer posted bond immediately, and Ruby was released with trial scheduled for 6 months out. As we left the courtroom, Ruby finally looked at me. Her eyes were full of something I couldn't quite read, maybe anger or fear or regret, but she didn't say anything. Jeremy walked us to our car and said the criminal charges meant Ruby would face serious consequences regardless of how our civil case resolved. That night, Dad and I had a long conversation about settlement. Knowing the criminal case would proceed no matter what we decided in civil court changed things. Ruby would face criminal penalties and possibly jail time even if we settled the money issue. The question was whether we wanted to spend years more fighting for full restitution when we might never collect it, or take a settlement that would let Dad rebuild his life now. Diane had been negotiating hard with Ruby's lawyer and had gotten the offer up to $400,000, plus Ruby paying all of Dad's medical expenses and all our legal fees. It wasn't the $2 million Ruby stole, but it was enough for Dad to rent a decent apartment, cover his health care, and live modestly for the rest of his life. Dad said he wanted to accept. He was tired of fighting and just wanted to start over. I asked him 3 times if he was sure because once we accepted, we couldn't change our minds. He said he was sure. He'd lost enough years of his life to Ruby's greed and didn't want to lose more years to legal battles. I called Diane and told her we'd accept $400,000 plus medical expenses and legal fees. She said she'd draw up the settlement agreement. The next 5 days felt endless while I agonized over whether we were making the right decision. I kept doing math in my head, calculating that $400,000 was only 20% of what Ruby stole. 20% felt like letting Ruby win. But then I'd look at Dad and see how exhausted he was, how much the stress was affecting his health, and I'd remember what Aurora said about this being his choice. On the 5th day, Diane called with the final settlement agreement. Ruby would pay $400,000 plus reimburse all of Dad's medical bills from the past year and pay both our legal fees in full. The settlement included Ruby admitting in writing that she breached her fiduciary duty as Dad's power of attorney and misappropriated his inheritance for her personal benefit. She had to pay the full amount within 30 days or face immediate judgment for the complete $2 million plus interest and penalties. If she missed the deadline by even 1 day, the settlement was void, and we'd go back to fighting for everything. Diane said the 30-day deadline with the massive penalty was her way of ensuring Ruby took this seriously and actually paid. Ruby would have to liquidate assets fast to come up with $400,000 in cash that quickly. I signed the settlement papers in Diane's office 3 days later, and Dad's signature shook so badly he had to try twice to write his name. Diane filed everything with the court that same afternoon, and Ruby had 30 days to come up with $400,000 or lose everything to the full judgment. The next 2 weeks felt strange because we were just waiting to see if Ruby could actually pay, and part of me wondered if she'd hidden money somewhere that would let her keep living her fancy life. But Diane called on day 19 to say Ruby had listed her house for sale, and it went under contract within 48 hours because she priced it low to move it fast. Ruby's luxury car disappeared from her driveway and got replaced with nothing, and neighbors told me they saw moving trucks taking furniture away in the middle of the night like she was trying to hide her fall from grace. On day 28, Diane confirmed Ruby had liquidated nearly everything, and the $400,000 would clear on time. Ruby moved into a small apartment across town in a building with peeling paint and broken security doors, the kind of place she would have made fun of 3 years ago. I heard from a former colleague that Ruby got a job as a bookkeeper at a small accounting firm, sitting in a cubicle doing data entry for 40 hours a week. Her consulting business completely dead because no one would hire someone convicted of elder abuse. With the settlement money in Dad's account, I started looking at senior living options that would give him support without being institutional. We toured 5 different places over 2 weeks, and Dad hated the first 4 because they reminded him too much of the facility Ruby had dumped him in. The 5th place was called Meadowbrook Senior Community, and it had small 1-bedroom apartments with kitchenettes, a community dining room for people who wanted company, and staff who checked on residents daily without being intrusive. Dad could cook his own meals or eat downstairs, join activities or stay private, and there were nurses available if he needed medical help. The rent was $1,500 a month, including utilities and basic services, which meant the settlement money would cover his housing for over 20 years if he was careful with other expenses. We signed the lease that day, and Dad cried when he got the keys to his own apartment, the first place that was truly his, since Ruby sold his house. I helped him buy basic furniture from thrift stores and discount places because the settlement money had to last, and Dad said he didn't need fancy things anyway, after living on streets where he owned nothing but the clothes he wore. Dad moved into Meadowbrook on a Tuesday, and I took the day off work to help him settle in. His apartment was small but clean with windows that got morning sun, and Dad stood in the middle of the empty living room for a long time, just looking around like he couldn't believe he had walls and a door that locked. We spent the day arranging furniture and stocking his kitchen with groceries, and by evening Dad's apartment felt like an actual home instead of just a place to exist. His next-door neighbor knocked around dinner time to introduce herself and invite Dad to the community game night on Thursday, and Dad accepted even though I could tell he was nervous about socializing after years of isolation. Over the next few months, Dad's physical health improved in ways that seemed impossible after seeing him on that street corner. The regular meals put weight back on his frame and his face filled out until he started looking like my father again instead of a skeleton. His dental work took 3 appointments and cost $8,000, but afterwards Dad could eat without pain for the first time in 2 years. The respiratory infection cleared up with antibiotics and proper rest, and Dad's cough finally disappeared after months of keeping me awake at night. By month 4, Dad had gained 30 pounds, and his doctor said his vital signs were better than they'd been in years, though the damage from street exposure would probably cause problems as he got older. The criminal trial happened in November, 6 months after the charges got filed. Ruby's lawyer negotiated a plea deal where she admitted to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and theft by deception in exchange for probation instead of jail time. The prosecutor agreed because Dad's settlement meant Ruby had paid some restitution, and they said proving criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt would be hard even with all our evidence. Ruby stood in court looking small and tired in a cheap suit, nothing like the confident woman who'd accepted awards in designer clothes and pleaded guilty to both charges without looking at Dad or me. The judge sentenced her to 5 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and permanent prohibition from ever holding power of attorney or serving as a fiduciary for anyone. Ruby got a criminal record that would show up on every background check for the rest of her life, making it impossible for her to work in finance or consulting ever again. She also had to pay an additional $50,000 in restitution to Dad over the probation period, which the judge said was separate from our settlement and couldn't be avoided. Ruby left the courthouse through a side door, and I never saw her face clearly that day, just the back of her head as she disappeared into a waiting car. After Ruby's conviction became public record, several family members reached out to apologize. Dad's brother called crying to say he was sorry for believing Ruby's lies about Dad moving to Florida, and he sent a check for $500 even though we didn't ask for money. 2 of Mom's sisters drove up to visit Dad at Meadowbrook and brought casseroles and apologies, saying they should have questioned Ruby's story more carefully. Dad forgave them all immediately because he said family was too important to lose over mistakes, but I could see the hurt in his eyes when he talked about the years they could have helped him, but didn't. Other relatives never reached out at all and just disappeared from our lives like they'd never existed, and Dad grieved those relationships more than he grieved the money Ruby stole. His cousin, who he'd been close to for 50 years, never called again after the trial, and Dad would sometimes mention her with this confused sadness like he couldn't understand how someone could just vanish. I told him that people who abandoned him when he needed help weren't worth keeping, but Dad said it wasn't that simple when you'd loved someone your whole life. Dad and I fell into a routine where I visited him every Tuesday and Friday evening for dinner. Sometimes we ate in his apartment and sometimes in the community dining room where Dad introduced me to his new friends, and I watched him slowly come back to life through these small social connections. He joined a weekly card game and a book club and started volunteering to help other residents who had trouble with technology or paperwork. Dad made friends with his neighbor, and they watched game shows together most afternoons, and he told me once that having people who expected to see him regularly made him feel human again after years of being invisible on the streets. Our dinners became the anchors of my week too, and I realized how much I'd missed having a parent after thinking I'd lost Dad forever to Ruby's lies. We didn't talk about Ruby much during these visits because Dad said he was trying to focus on rebuilding instead of remembering what got destroyed, but sometimes the pain would surface and we'd sit quietly together while he processed feelings too big for words. Aria contacted me 8 months after the settlement to ask if I'd speak at an elder abuse prevention workshop she was organizing. The workshop would train social workers and healthcare providers to recognize warning signs of financial exploitation, and Aria thought our story would help people understand how abuse happens, even in families that seem normal. I said yes, even though the idea of publicly sharing what Ruby did made me feel sick, because I kept thinking about all the other elderly people suffering in silence while their families stole from them. The workshop happened on a Saturday morning in a community center conference room with 40 people attending, and I stood at a podium telling strangers how my sister abandoned our father to homelessness while living off his stolen inheritance. I explained the warning signs we'd missed, the lies Ruby told that seemed believable, and the systems that failed to protect Dad even when people suspected abuse. Several attendees came up afterwards to share their own stories of family financial exploitation, and I realized how common this crime was, and how rarely it got reported or prosecuted. Arya asked me to speak at 3 more workshops over the next year, and each time got a little easier, even though it never stopped hurting to relive what Ruby did. Dad still had hard days where the trauma overwhelmed him despite all the progress he'd made. Some mornings he'd wake up disoriented and think he was still on the streets, and it would take him hours to calm down and remember he was safe in his apartment. He struggled to trust people even when they were genuinely trying to help, and his therapist said this was normal for someone who'd been so completely betrayed by family. Dad had trouble trusting me sometimes too, which hurt more than anything Ruby had done, and there were moments when he'd question whether I was really visiting out of love, or if I had some hidden agenda. His therapist told me this wasn't personal and might never fully resolve, because being abandoned by your own child creates wounds that don't completely heal, and I learned to be patient with Dad's suspicions even when they felt like accusations. On his worst days, Dad would cancel our dinner plans and not answer his phone, and I'd have to resist the urge to drive over and check on him because his therapist said he needed space to process his feelings without me hovering. Ruby and I had zero contact after the settlement papers got signed. I heard through relatives that she was working her bookkeeper job and living in her small apartment, taking the bus to work because she couldn't afford a car anymore. Someone said they saw her at a discount grocery store buying generic brands and using coupons, a total reversal from the luxury lifestyle she'd maintained on Dad's stolen money. I felt nothing when I heard these updates, not satisfaction or vindication or even anger, just a hollow emptiness where my sister used to exist in my heart. Sometimes I'd remember things from our childhood before Mom died, back when Ruby actually seemed to care about family, and I'd wonder what happened to that person, or if she'd ever really existed at all. Dad said he'd forgiven Ruby, but I wasn't there yet, and didn't know if I ever would be, because forgiveness felt like saying what she did was okay, when it absolutely wasn't. I deleted Ruby's number from my phone and blocked her on all social media, and made it clear to relatives that I didn't want updates about her life, because she'd made her choices and now had to live with them. Aurora helped me tackle the debt from the legal battle through a strict budget and payment plan. Between attorney fees, Dad's medical bills, and my own expenses during the months I was supporting him, I'd accumulated $23,000 in credit card debt at interest rates that made me sick. Aurora sat with me one night and created a spreadsheet tracking every dollar I spent, cutting expenses I didn't need and finding extra money in places I hadn't thought to look. I started working overtime whenever possible and picked up freelance projects on weekends, funneling every extra dollar toward the debt. Aurora loaned me $5,000 interest-free when my car broke down, and I couldn't afford both repairs and debt payments, and she refused to let me feel guilty about accepting help after everything I'd done for Dad. It took a full year of eating cheap meals and skipping any entertainment that cost money, but I finally paid off the last credit card in December and cried with relief at being financially stable again. The experience made me more careful with money in ways I'd never been before, because I'd seen how quickly security could disappear and how devastating it was to have nothing when you needed help. I started an emergency fund with money from each paycheck and kept detailed records of every expense, determined to never be in that vulnerable position again. I started an emergency fund with money from each paycheck and kept detailed records of every expense, determined to never be in that vulnerable position again. On what would have been Mom's birthday, Dad called me at 7 in the morning asking if I wanted to visit her grave. We hadn't been there together since the funeral 5 years ago, back when Ruby stood beside us pretending to grieve while already planning to steal everything. I picked Dad up from his apartment and we drove to the cemetery in silence, both of us carrying flowers we'd bought from the grocery store. Dad moved slowly between the headstones, his cane tapping against the ground, and when we reached Mom's grave, he dropped to his knees and started crying. He talked to her about what Ruby did, how she'd stolen everything and left him on the streets, and I stood behind him listening to his voice break over and over. I realized he wasn't just grieving the money or the betrayal, he was grieving the loss of both his daughters in different ways. One who abandoned him and one who had to become his caretaker instead of just his child. We stayed there for an hour while Dad told Mom everything, and when we finally left, he seemed lighter somehow, like sharing the truth with her had lifted some weight he'd been carrying alone. 2 weeks later, Dad told me over dinner that he'd forgiven Ruby. I'd brought him Chinese food and we were eating in his small living room when he said it, completely out of nowhere, and I almost choked on my rice. He explained that carrying hatred was destroying him from the inside, making him bitter and angry in ways that hurt him more than it hurt Ruby. I told him I wasn't there yet and might never be, because forgiveness felt like saying what she did was okay when it absolutely wasn't. Dad nodded and said he understood, that this was his choice for his own peace, and he didn't expect me to feel the same way. I respected his decision even though I couldn't share it, because after everything he'd been through, he deserved to find peace however he could. 2 years after I found Dad on that street corner, he's stable in his one-bedroom apartment with enough money to live modestly for the rest of his life. He volunteers at a homeless shelter twice a week, serving meals and talking to people who remind him of where he was, and he's told me it gives him purpose to help others who are struggling the way he did. His health is better, his mind is clearer, and he's made friends in his building who play cards with him on Thursday nights. I visit him twice a week for dinner, and we talk about normal things now, not just legal battles and Ruby's betrayal, and sometimes we even laugh together. I've learned that justice in elder abuse cases is messy and incomplete, that family betrayal leaves scars that never fully fade, and that sometimes survival and stability matter more than perfect revenge. Ruby lost everything she stole and more, but she's still out there living her life while Dad will never get back the years she took from him. The legal system gave us some money back but couldn't restore his dignity or erase the trauma of sleeping on concrete and begging strangers for help. But Dad is safe now, housed and fed and surrounded by people who care about him, and after everything we've been through together, that's enough.